So, we were going to talk about it later, but I'll bring it out now. Because I've shown you this photo before, right?
Not shown me. You've spoken of it.
All right. So three guys on the street, but it's the one on the left that we're particularly interested in. Okay.
Yeah. I can see what you mean. So there's like those quite deep set eyes.
Yeah,
that's familiar. Is that called a widow's peak when it goes like, or is it anyway? The sort of slightly receding hairline, whatever that shape's called.
The stern look,
definitely the slightly stern look, but it could be because
possibly the nose,
the sun in his eyes,
could be.
You have to see on the side angle to be concerned about the nose.
That's right. What do you think?
It definitely could be. So, remind us, where is this photo?
So this is in Wellington, mid-1980s, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's an inquiry that's underway into the sinking of a Russian ship in New Zealand waters.
Yep. Okay, that's fine. So, why is Vladimir Putin there?
Well, that is a really good question, and is one of the huge questions that remain about this boat sinking. But you know what? It's not even the weirdest or the biggest about this whole sinking.
Right. Well, that sounds like a good episode of Long Story Short then.
Yeah. So this is the story of how a Russian ship ended up deep beneath the sea in New Zealand waters during the Cold War, a story of twists, turns, and tragedy. I'm Eugene.
I'm Adam. And this is Long Story Short, a podcast of crimes and catastrophes, scandals and scammers, secrets and lies, strange tales you've never heard of, and new twists on stories you thought you knew.
All right, so Sunday, February 16, 1986, a helicopter buzzed above a large ship in the Marlborough Sounds at the top of the South Island. When I say large, I want to get a bit geeky here. We're talking 155 metres long, 20 tonnes, 23 metres broad, 13.5 metres deep, with 2 diesel engines which have a total power output of 446 kilowatts.
Please tell me more about the kilowatts. It's large, okay. Also, it is magnificent, a thing of beauty, which is why that helicopter is overhead. There's a camera or video camera or something on board. The ship is sailing into Picton from Wellington through the stunning Tory Channel, and the ship's agents had arranged a photographer to get some pretty aerial photos.
Yeah, and on the bridge was an experienced mariner, Captain Don Jamison. He was on board as the pilot, so that's the person whose job it is to use their skills and local knowledge of a particular area to protect a ship from collision or grounding. He joined the ship in Wellington for this passage to Picton.
Right, so this large ship with a big engine, it was a passenger cruise liner called the Mikhail Lermontov. And you can say it a little bit better if you try harder, but Mikhail Lermontov, more or less like that. And as you may have guessed from its name, it was a Russian-owned ship. Well, actually, it flew the flag of the USSR. What is it? United Soviet Socialist Republic?
The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
It's been so long since we've had a USSR, I forgot what the letter stood for. Anyway, this is 1986, remember. So it's before the fall of the Soviet Union, but frankly, not much before the fall of the Soviet Union. It's things are slightly heading downwards. We're still in the time of the Cold War. The Iron Curtain still separated East from West. But the Mikhail Lermontov was like an oceanic envoy, giving passengers from the West a glimpse of Soviet life, complete with caviar, I believe. So the captain and most of the crew were Russian, but most of the passengers on this cruise were actually Australian. Many of them elderly, as is what you get on cruises sometimes. They joined the ship in Auckland for a 9-day cruise along the east coast of the North Island, into Wellington, down at the bottom, across Cook Strait to the Marlborough Sounds, then down the west coast of the South Island to the beautiful Milford Sounds. Sounds, it's just one, isn't it? And then across the Tasman Sea to Sydney.
Nice.
Yeah, it was built as the cruise of a lifetime, which could be a bit over the top, though it would turn out to be a cruise that no one on board would ever forget. So prescient marketing, arguably.
And look, you've got a bit of cruise ship experience, Adam. What's the nicest cruise you've done?
I have cruised. Yes, I've done 2. They're both press trips. Makes quite a big difference if it's not your money that you're spending when you do these things. And also being press trips, really the general kaupapa, the plan of action for the whole trip is that you drink a lot with a crowd of other journalists, and then you each write a piece about whatever it is you can still remember by the end. So the first one I did, this was yonks ago, it was more than 20 years ago. It was so it was around Greece and Italy. I was living in the UK at the time, so it wasn't that much of a stretch. And it should have been awesome because the places we went to,
Greece and
Rhodes and
Sounds
Santorini
cool.
and Venice and all this sort of stuff. But it was a kind of a really oddly low budget cruise. The ship was an old rust bucket, and my room literally smelt a little bit of poo, which really changes the whole tone.
They didn't put that on the pamphlet.
They didn't put it on the pamphlet. And there were other things that weren't the general experience, but because I was part of this press trip, there was some quite odd, extremely posh, extraordinarily racist people on our press trip. But it was a very multinational cruise. So they were saying rude things about Italians.
I got to say, you were not selling cruises to me.
However, I did one far more recently, about 4 or 5 years ago, with Princess Cruises, and it was kind of fantastic. It was really great. It was 1,000,000 times better. The boat, I don't think you call it a boat, the ship. The ship was really fancy, really comfortable, very shiny. And actually, the route wasn't dissimilar to the one that the Mikhail Lermontov was doing. Basically, I just did half the cruise because they don't want to give you the whole thing for free. But basically, looping around the islands of Aotearoa, then scooting across. We went to Tasmania and then up to Sydney, and then I flew home. It was awesome. There were swimming pools on board, which is fun. Restaurants. There was a community choir. There was quizzes. I love a quiz. I had felt a bit snobby about the idea of cruises before I went on this one, but it was really enjoyable.
Yeah.
What about you?
I similarly felt very snobby about cruises, was very anti them, had my arm twisted by the family, and we went on one all together with adult kids around the islands of Hawaii, and it was magnificent, I must say. And because I've only done one, I suppose I could call it the cruise of a lifetime.
Yeah. There you go.
So anyway, let's get back to this story, which... I mean, I'm sure people would love to hear more about Greece and Italy, but anyway.
Mikhail is more interesting than...
Ship, boat.
Yes.
There's all these definitions of what makes a ship versus a boat. One of them is that a ship can carry a boat, but a boat can't carry a ship. Anyway.
Oh,
that's
okay.
a shout out,
I like that. I'm going to think
my friend Andrew.
I'm going to reflect on that.
If you're listening. Right. Anyway, back in 1986, they were all, 408 passengers, 329 crew aboard the ship, and not a sheep. And you could eat red caviar and cold smoked sturgeon, drink vodka, and be entertained by Russian folk songs and dances. But there was also the usual trappings of cruise life that you've just described, 5 bars, a swimming pool, hair salons, a gymnasium, a sauna, shops. People were there to sing and dance and have a good time.
Yeah, and so they were heading towards Picton. That's the port at the top of the South Island where the main passenger ferries from the North Island dock. And Captain Jamison, he's the local expert, was on the bridge when suddenly... Suddenly nothing. It docked at port around 8 in the morning, pretty uneventful. Yeah, okay. On this leg of the trip, Wellington to Picton, nothing bad happens. This is like prologue, preamble. Though some people would later remark that it was unusual for a ship of that size to have come through the Tory Channel, which is basically a drowned valley within the Marlborough Sounds. So it's quite a skinny route for a 150-metre ship with an enormous engine, as you described. But
do those stats again if you want.
Yeah, no, don't. There was no issue. Everything was fine.
Captain Jamison, who was employed by the Marlborough Harbour Board, disembarked and headed into the office, even though it was a Sunday morning. He was a busy guy, as well as having pilot duties for large vessels in the area. He was the harbour master, and during this time, he was also the acting general manager. The previous one had been let go, and there was a bunch of legal back and forth going on, which seemed to be dragging out, finding a replacement. It was a long process. So in the meantime, Captain Jamison is acting in that job as well.
Right, so a man of many hats. Actually, and for several months of the year before, 1985, he'd also held the role of Deputy Harbour Master as well. I'm not sure how that works because he was also the Harbour Master, so how can you be deputy to yourself? Anyway, point being, busy guy.
Yeah. So on Sunday, February 16, 1986, he successfully piloted this large Russian ship into Picton, then headed into the office to get some more work done. At midday, he returned to the Mikhail Lermontov with the harbour board chairman for a sit-down lunch with the ship's captain, Captain Vladislav Vorab. Oh, hang on. Help me out here, Adam. You've written me a guide.
Voroybiev,
thank you. Apologies,
Voroybiev.
And kind of like a formal celebration of the arrival of the ship. It's worth mentioning there were a few drinks consumed at this lunch. Anyway, just take note of that. Afterwards, Captain Jamison rushed back to the office to finish some work, picked up a bag of clothes, then went back to the ship at 2:50 p.m. He was cutting it a bit fine because the ship was leaving at 3 p.m. I guess they can't go until he's there, though, to be fair.
Yeah.
What unfolded over the next few hours would change his life forever and lead to minute analysis and intense speculation about his movements and his motivations.
All right. So we've got to the bit where it's always nice to stop for a moment and give some historical context. 1986. So for Russia, 1986 is a big year. Mikhail Gorbachev was the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. He was proposing his big plan for the abolition of nuclear weapons. So big geopolitical year. The USSR was starting work on its famous Mir space station. And this was the year that they fired the first component, the core module, up into space. So they're still, big in space. In April, though, huge deal. There was the Chernobyl disaster, the explosion of a nuclear reactor in an area today known as the country of Ukraine. In the USS, the president is Ronald Reagan. The Iran-Contra affair was revealed. The US had secretly been selling weapons to Iran to win the release of American hostages. And the Statue of Liberty turned 100.
Big birthday party.
In New Zealand, the Prime Minister was the Labour Party's David Lange, a man who was known for his sharp wit, including a snappy one-liner that you can have to wait for, but that would arise from the story we're telling today.
Yeah. So now there's another bit of context you said you wanted to add, right? So something that you mentioned about a millisecond after I raised the idea of us taking a look at the sinking of the Mikhail Lermontov.
Yeah, we need to know, who was Mikhail Lermontov? The answer is just one of the greatest Russian writers and poets of all time, known as the poet of the Caucasus. His influence on Russian literature continues today, apparently. Born in Moscow in 1814, in fact, kind of Scottish on his father's side, because a Scottish ancestor ran away to fight in Europe in some 17th century wars and served alongside Russian troops and didn't get home. It's all a bit confusing, but yeah, obviously he had a knack for writing. First became famous for his Death of the Poet, which feels like an ominous place to start your poetic career, but there you go. They named a town after him and a ship, the one we're talking about. Currently, story-wise, parked up in the Marlborough Sounds. And that ship was built in East Germany in 1972, by the way. And, last bit of thrilling context, it wasn't actually uncommon. The Russians have always taken quite a lot of pride in their literature and stuff. This whole name a big boat after a poet was a thing. So apart from our mate Mikhail, you'll of course be familiar with the ship, the Alexander Pushkin, the Ivan Franko, the Taras Shevchenko, and who can forget, the Shota Rustaveli. So there you go.
I had. Anyway, back to this ill-fated voyage. So to recap, the Mikhail Lermontov had sailed down the east coast of New Zealand and across the Cook Strait to Picton. About 3 p.m. on February the 16th, 1986, she left Picton behind and set off for a cruise of the Marlborough Sounds. From there, she was due to sail to Milford Sound, which, if you haven't been to, by the way, you should, because it's one of the wonders of the world anyway. And then across to Sydney, Australia, where the 408 passengers, mostly elderly Australians, would disembark. That's the plan anyway. The 329 mostly Russian crew was led by Captain Vladislav Vorobyov. He first went to sea in...
That was closer.
Okay. He first went to sea in 1956, trained at the Leningrad Higher Marine School, then started work for the Baltic Shipping Company, owners of the ship, the Mikhail Lermontov, and started making his way up through the ranks. He was staff captain of the Alexander Pushkin, aforementioned, before taking over as captain of the Mikhail Lermontov in 1979.
Isn't it sad that we only really properly engage with the CVs of ships' captains when their boats sink? Anyway, so this dude had plenty of experience, especially on ships, with literary associations.
Heaps.
Now, we also mentioned Captain Don Jamison had hopped back on board too. So he had piloted the ship into Picton from Wellington, and then he ran around all day doing all those other jobs we mentioned, harbour master, acting general manager of the harbour board, possibly chief bottle washer, before rejoining the ship. So his job now was basically to do the same thing again, more or less, but in reverse. Help safely navigate the Mikhail Lermontov out of the moderately treacherous Marlborough Sounds. And that's within his usual role as pilot for the area. That's that's his top job.
Bread and butter.
Normally, when he was piloting a ship out to sea, so there was a point where Captain Jamison would hop back off and take a little boat, a pilot boat, back to Picton, which makes sense. And he would do this once they'd crossed a sort of an imaginary line across the water, which marked the end of the area of the Sounds that required a pilot. But on this trip, the plan was he'd actually stay on board for a few days, even once they've crossed that line. Bit of R&R. It's a cruise ship.
Yeah,
5 bars, swimming pools, caviar. Sturgeon. I don't think I've ever eaten sturgeon. So R&R, and then he was going to do a little bit more coastal piloting and guide them around Milford Sound, and then take his captain's hat off again, more holiday, and then sail all the way across to Sydney. So
he deserved a holiday.
Yeah, exactly. So it was partly going to be a freelance gig. He'd taken some leave from his job, and so it's all a bit complicated. He's officially a contractor to the ship's owners. As soon as they cross that line, the line, if you've got the map in your head, it's sort of a line from Paparoa Point in the east across to the northern end of Motuara Island and all the way to the opposite side of Queen Charlotte's Sound. That's one for the geeks. But whether you can follow the finer geographical details or not, the reason we're going on about it is this imaginary line is actually kind of important, because one of the things people will debate for years to come is, why was Captain Jamison still on the bridge after the ship had sailed past that line?
One thing that was never questioned was Captain Jamison's experience and reputation. At the time of the voyage, he was 51 years old and had been at sea since he was 16 or 17. He worked for the New Zealand Shipping Company, later joined the Southland Harbour Board as tugmaster, then pilot. And in 1970, he headed to Picton to take up the roles of harbour master and chief pilot.
Again, another nautical CV that we wouldn't have come across
Exactly.
otherwise.
Yeah, but distinguished.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
by 1986, he was very, very familiar with the waters around the Marlborough Sounds. Not just the water either. He was also knowledgeable about the history, and during the passage out of Picton, he kept up a commentary over the PA to inform the passengers about the various historical sites around the shoreline. And there were plenty of sights to see. For instance, soon after leaving dock, the Mikhail Lermontov steered to nearby Shakespeare Bay, which is where Shakespeare lived. Oh, no, sorry. It wasn't. Where passengers could... Anyway, laughing at my own jokes, that's terrible. Where passengers could see the ship Edwin Fox, one of the world's oldest surviving merchant sailing ships, and the only surviving convict ship. At the time, the Edwin Fox was kind of abandoned in the bay as enthusiasts figured out what to do with her, but she was subsequently refloated and towed to dry docks at Picton, where she's a tourist attraction to this day. Anyway, Captain Jamison had swung the Mikhail Lermontov into Shakespeare Bay very soon after leaving Picton to show the passengers this important relic, and this was when there was the first sign of trouble. According to Captain Jamison, he became concerned the ship wasn't turning as fast as necessary. He tried a bunch of manoeuvres, engaging a bow thruster, for instance, which are basically extra propellers that help push a ship sideways, and he found the ship wasn't responding like it should. He ordered the engines be chucked into reverse, and eventually he said, "We pulled up approximately 30 metres from the shore."
That sounds pretty close.
In the context of a ship this size, yeah. That must have been alarming. It later turned out the bow thrusters hadn't been operational when he went to use them. The crew hadn't expected they'd be needed, and Jamison hadn't asked if they were ready. There was another thing that happened in Shakespeare Bay. On this day, the weather wasn't great. It was rainy and a bit cold, even though it was summer. How unusual in New Zealand. On the bridge where the ship was controlled from, Captain Jamison took a fall, slipping on wet gratings and landing heavily on his back. His keys and his glasses fell out of his pocket. Later, people would ask whether this was significant.
Right. Was it the ship that was lurching, or was it him that was lurching? Maybe. Okay. Captain Vorobyev I think it's Vorobyev, had been worried about how close the ship came to running aground at Shakespeare Bay. And there was another time that he felt they were too close to shore at Golden Point in the Queen Charlotte Sound. Captain Jamison was keen on giving the passengers a decent view of this very beautiful part of the world, but according to Captain Vorobyev, they were too close. Even one of the passengers, a yachty, knew a bit about the sea, felt that they were unusually close, telling a journalist later that you could just about have reached out and touched the leaves on the trees. Notwithstanding those incidents, about 4:30 p.m, Captain Vorobyev decided to leave the bridge. Before he left, he asked Captain Jamison to show him on the charts where he intended to take the ship and where he would end his duty. So that's that line in the sea and all that stuff. So Jamison pointed out a path past Ship Cove and then up to Cape Jackson at the tip of the Marlborough Sounds. And this was actually some distance past that imaginary line where Jamison's job as Picton pilot ended. But Vorobyev seemed happy enough with the plan, which would take the ship on a wide and safe berth out of the Sounds. Vorobyev explained the plan to the chief navigator, and he left the bridge. And he wouldn't be back there until after the ship had run aground.
With Captain Jamison in charge, the Mikhail Lermontov was sailing at 15 knots, which was its maximum speed, out of the Marlborough Sounds. He was operating by visual cues, never once referring to the charts. About 1.4 kilometres away from Cape Jackson, Jamison made a decision, one that would later be revisited and second-guessed over and over and over again. He lined up a course to squeeze the ship through a passage between the tip of Cape Jackson and a lighthouse. The lighthouse sits about half a kilometre offshore atop a rock that stabs out of the sea, and beneath the surface near the lighthouse is a shallow reef.
Thus the lighthouse, I guess.
In the 1800s, it was the site of at least 2 shipwrecks. Captain Jamison had never taken a ship the size of Mikhail Lermontov through the passage. Frankly, it seemed madness to even think about it. He'd been through there on fishing trips on small boats, but that was it. Totally different thing. However, for some reason, he ordered port 10 degrees and altered the ship's direction to a calamitous course.
Port, that's left when you're facing the front, right? I think it is.
Hang on.
Yeah, it's the
Connor's got his thumb up, so
port
yeah,
left, starboard right.
Yeah.
That's just minor facts around here.
There you go. On the bridge, Captain Connor. On the bridge, the Russian crew members were on duty. They were somewhere between sort of puzzled and a state of what the fuckedness. The second mate said to the navigator, "I can see a line of white water in there," meaning the passage between Cape Jackson and the lighthouse. That's what he's talking about. And he's thinking, what is he doing? The navigator put the question directly to Jamison. "Captain, why are you taking us so close? Why are you taking us in so close?" Sorry. Jamison replied, "There is no reason to worry. There is enough water in that place."
But really, was there enough water in that place?
Meanwhile, passengers sitting on deck having a drink noticed the white water too. Those with a bit of nautical nous, like that yachty, knew that white water was often a sign of trouble below, rocks, for instance, or reefs. But hey, they figured they were in the hands of an experienced pilot and crew, one who'd been providing excellent commentary since they left Picton. And initially, the navigator and second mate were assured by Jamison's soothing words too. Then, as they drew closer to the lines of white water, the navigator began to prepare himself to send a message to the engine room in case he needed to do so in a hurry. He later said he was worried currents might drive the ship towards shore, and he thought in an emergency the ship could be manoeuvred by the engines to save it from danger. But at 5:37 p.m, there came a terrible sound. Nothing was saving the Mikhail Lermontov from danger. There was a horrible graunching sound, and it reverberated for miles. On board, everyone felt 2 or 3 shocks as the ship gouged itself. Yeah, it didn't gorge gouged itself against rocks just below the surface, ripping holes in the hull. 3 large holes on the port side, in fact. Captain Vorobyev, who had left the bridge about an hour earlier, suddenly reappeared. Under questioning after the sinking, the navigator would be asked about the sudden arrival of the ship. Questions like, how long after the impact did the captain return to the bridge? And when the captain arrived on the bridge, was he fully dressed? answers right after the break.
So where were we? The Mikhail Lermontov, a Russian-owned and mostly Russian-crewed ship, had struck rocks off Cape Jackson at the head of the Marlborough Sounds while under the control of a New Zealand pilot, Captain Don Jamison. At the same time, the actual captain of the ship, Captain Vladislav Vorobyev, was away from the bridge for about an hour, but he had just reappeared. And just before the break, we let you know the intriguing question that officials asked the navigator in the aftermath of the sinking. When the captain arrived on the bridge, was he fully dressed? The answer from the navigator, I simply don't remember.
Now, that was a bit mean and clickbaity to pose that question before the break, but the captain was, in fact, fully clothed. And there was a good reason the question had been asked. It was simply that when he left the bridge, he said it was because he was cold and wet. Remember, it was raining and quite unpleasant, enough for Jamison to have slipped over. And the captain had gone down to his cabin, for a shower and to get changed. He was quizzed at some length about why it took him so long to come back. And basically the answer was he was faffing about and didn't feel any need to rush. He, quote, took a shower, got changed, went to the mirror, combed his hair, straightened his tie. By the way, those were his exact, albeit translated, words about what he got up to in his cabin. Quote, I was not in a great hurry, he said.
That's definitely a case where the question was quite a lot more interesting than the answer.
Yeah.
Eugene. Anyway, onwards.
But, yeah, there was a point to it. Then he was out in the corridor on his way back to the bridge when he felt the impact. When he got to the bridge, Vorobyev asked the chief navigator why they were in this predicament. The chief navigator basically pointed towards Jamison, and when Vorobyev asked him if he agreed with the port 10 degrees order, the chief navigator said Jamison had persuaded him the passage was safe.
Captain Vorobyev must have been wondering what the hell everyone was thinking, but he didn't really have time for an inquisition right then because the ship was in danger of sinking. So above the din of the alarms going off on board, the engine room crew reported that the sea was flooding the ship's refrigerated stores, and then there were reports of water gushing into the laundry, the gymnasium, the printing room, maybe the caviar room, you never know. Quickly, the Mikhail Lermontov started to list to starboard, so that's the right-hand side if you're facing the front, landlubbers. Vorobyev asked Jamison for the safest place to take the ship, and Jamison recommended the nearby Port Gore, which was just around the corner. And that was basically the end of Jamison's involvement. From here on, Vorobyev was the one calling the shots and in charge. Oh, and Jamison did have one other role. He spent a lot of time on the radios, and he observed some strange things.
Soon after the ship hit the rocks, Jamison called Picton Harbour radio, telling them, "This is a Mayday situation. The Mikhail Lermontov, we have struck a rock at Cape Jackson and we are proceeding into Port Gore. We will require emergency services. The vessel is in danger of sinking. The vessel is in danger of sinking. Making water."
And Wellington Radio responded, "Received, Mayday."
Jamison continued, "Mikhail Lermontov has struck ground off Cape Jackson. Vessel listing to starboard and making water." Then a minute or so later, "We will want emergency services for disembarkation of passengers. The situation is stable at the moment, I think." So, you get the picture. Jamison was calling for help. He thought the situation was serious. After all, there was a passenger liner taking on water at sea. There was a bit of chat back and forth over the radio as those on land and other vessels at sea figured out how they could help.
And then Wellington Radio asked, "Request you confirm this is a Mayday situation."
Jamison later said he referred this question to the ship's captain, who said, no, it wasn't a Mayday situation. Captain Vorobyev also said he did not require assistance from any other vessels, an order which Jamison conveyed. "The captain advises me he does not require assistance. He does not require assistance. Please pass that on to the ship that was on its way." Meanwhile, in the radio room, the Russian crew had also been on the airwaves under the orders of the captain. They were on a satellite radio telephone call to the ship's owners back in Vladivostok. For the passengers, meanwhile, the captain had advised them there was a, quote, slight water intrusion, unquote, but that they had a good crew and things would be fixed, situation normal. The bars kept serving, the band kept playing, and some passengers kept dancing.
I'm pretty sure I've seen a movie where that's what happens on a cruise ship with a hole in it. But anyway, carry on.
Though, where was Rose? Though it must have been hard to stand upright. The starboard list was getting worse and worse, but they were sure there was nothing to worry about. However, as Jamison later put it, I felt the situation was worse than was being made known.
I think he might be right on that. When the Mikhail Lermontov reached Port Gore, she made contact with solid land again, although this time it was deliberate, gently grounding just off the beach. Meanwhile, an LPG tanker, the Tarihiko, had arrived on the scene, and its skipper, John Reedman, had ignored the call that no assistance was required. And Reedman offered to take passengers on board, but again, Captain Vorobyev declined. So the Mikhail Lermontov was sitting on sand quite close to shore, but Jamison noticed there was nothing being done to keep it there. He thought the anchors should be dropped, but they weren't. The ship began to drift, eventually heading out back into quite deep water. Hopelessly drifting, the engines were now powerless after the failure of the electrical systems because of the flooding. By this stage, the situation was obvious. The Mikhail Lermontov was going down and everyone needed to get off. The Tarihiko had put lifeboats in the water, and the Cook Strait ferry Arahura, which had also arrived on the scene, did the same. Hundreds of lives were saved. Nothing could save the Mikhail Lermontov, though, at 10:45 p.m, so that's sort of 5-ish hours since the crunch. 5 hours after hitting the rocks, following an unexplained decision from the pilot, the Russian passenger cruise ship sank to the ocean floor 30 metres below.
Initially, amidst the confusion, there were fears many had died, but by morning, it was established that, remarkably, though still very sadly, there was one victim, engineer Pavel Alexievich Zagliadimov, aged 33. A coroner later ruled he had likely drowned. Just before the collision, Pavel was seen going into a refrigerated area below deck. A large trolley fell across the door, making it impossible to open. And where he was last seen was one of the areas that had flooded first. His body has never been recovered.
All this just seems so bizarre, though, right? Even if you ignored Jamison's bonkers decision to squeeze over a reef in a giant ship, everything that happens after that is also so odd. You know, even after Jamison stopped being the one in control, you're sinking, but you cancel the Mayday. You end up grounded on a beach, which I'm no expert on shipwrecks, but near the land seems an excellent place to be if you're in a sinking ship. But then you let the ship drift out to deeper water again with everyone on board. What are they up to?
Yeah, good questions. And the ship was a $42 million loss to the Russians. That's about $142 million in today's money. It was a big, big deal. Surely all this meant there was going to be a full inquiry, right? Bzz, wrong. So it has to be said that this is one of the weirdest things about this weird series of events too. No, there are heaps more weird things to come, but so I'll hold fire in the rankings for now. But in the aftermath of the sinking, the New Zealand government, this was the Labour government led by David Longley, remember, began what it called a preliminary inquiry.
And by the way, it is around this time, it's later this same year that Longley rolled out one of his famous singers telling a British admiral who was being a bit scathing about New Zealand's anti-nuclear stance and so on, that New Zealand's value to the Western Alliance shouldn't be underestimated because, after all, quote, remember, we are the only member of the Western community to have sunk a Russian ship since the Second World War.
He loved his one-liners. Anyway, R.I.P. David Longley, this preliminary inquiry, witnesses such as the pilot, the captain, and the other senior crew were called to testify behind closed doors in Wellington, but a bunch of other people, including the passengers, were not. There's this quite captivating old TV footage and photos from the time of people arriving at these closed hearings, including some very serious-looking chaps who everyone presumed were, quote, officials from the Soviet embassy.
Right. And then very quickly, within days, the whole Russian crew had left the country. And then when the preliminary inquiry report was released just 10 days after the sinking, which feels pretty fast to me by the standards of these things, it was announced there was going to be no fuller formal inquiry. And that was a decision endorsed by the Minister of Transport, Richard Prebble. That was it. We're done and dusted. It's all over. Except Prebble faced months of questions in Parliament about this, particularly from a determined opposition MP who was very quickly making a name for himself, a man by the name of Winston Peters, at that stage still a member of the National Party. Now, if you've never heard of him by any chance, and if you're a New Zealander, that's almost impossible. But if you haven't heard of him, you've been missing it out. He's about as famous as New Zealand politicians get, and he's been in action for about 1 million years. After this, he formed his own party, New Zealand First. He's been a minister in several governments. He's been deputy prime minister. And it's fair to say he's managed to be at the centre of a fair few scandals over the years, including quite a few where he was the one leading the charge, pointing the finger. So Winston Peters was even further fired up when months later a police investigation into the sinking concluded that no charges would be laid. Police had considered charging Captain Don Jamison over the death of the crew member, but decided not to go ahead, and the reasons they gave was the heavy cost of a prosecution and also partly because the body was not recovered. That seems quite a weird reason. And there was also some legal questions about whether Jamison could actually be charged for something that he was doing when he was piloting a foreign vessel. And Peters was furious, and he pulled out one of his favourite phrases, "There had been a cover-up." The Police Association were not happy at Peters' insinuation and his aspersions at their integrity. But it wasn't just Peters who was wound up. One of his colleagues in the National Party, Norman Jones, said the Labour government and, quote, its friends in the Kremlin, end quote, would have been embarrassed if any case had been brought, implying that was the reason that no charges were laid.
So what did he mean by friends in the Kremlin? Well, remember, this was still during the Cold War, as we said, and anxieties about communist influence in the West was still a thing. Less than 10 years earlier, the National Party had run election ads featuring dancing Cossacks, which nudged and winked that the Labour Party was in cahoots with the commies. Also in the 1980s, New Zealand had a trading relationship with the USSR that was not insignificant. You know, we sold them butter and other agricultural products. They sold us stuff like rolling stock for trains and larder cars. Yes, larders. But Peters went further than just suggesting this was about letting a trading partner off the hook. In September 1986, he gave a speech where he said there was a, quote, smell about the whole episode and talked of collusion between the Soviets and the Labour government. His grounds for this, which he set out in the speech, were 5 unanswered questions.
5 questions. Number 1, when the vessel struck the rocks, why was contact first made with Vladivostok in eastern Siberia instead of with New Zealand authorities?
Second question, why was assistance from New Zealand ships turned down by those in control of the ship before she was abandoned?
3, why was the vessel not anchored in Gore Bay after beaching there, which would have stopped it drifting off again and sinking in deeper water?
Why were the vessel's watertight doors not closed to prevent her from foundering in the deep water?
Why did Richard Prebble, that was the Minister of Transport, right, act so hastily to rule out a formal inquiry when it was clear that the preliminary inquiry had apparently failed to ascertain all the facts?
As for the police saying the costs of a prosecution against Jamison would have been too high, well, Peters pointed out that around the same time, police were spending millions of dollars pursuing justice over the sinking of another ship in New Zealand waters. He was referring to the sinking of the Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior in Auckland 7 months before the Mikhail Lermontov went down.
Oh, right. So, yeah. I hadn't sort of clicked how close these big sinkings are. That's just 7 months apart.
Yeah. The rumour mill was in overdrive, and author Michael Gurin researched the case extensively for his book, The Mikhail Lermontov Enigma, and he summarised some of the main sort of scuttlebutt, I guess, if you like. So, what the hell's going on here? And these are all the sort of things that he came up with. That some believe the ship was a kind of seaborne secret agent, a cruise liner which was actually a spy vessel bristling with sophisticated communications equipment.
I like that one.
That she was deliberately sunk by the Russians so she could sit at the bottom of the ocean as part of some sort of global guidance system for its nuclear submarines.
I like this one even more.
And that New Zealand intentionally damaged the boat so she could be inspected closely to see if she really was a spy ship.
That one's silly. Sorry, I know you didn't ask me for
I didn't ask
me to
for your
rank the
opinions,
quality
but
of these
anyway,
series,
yeah. but let's emphasise.
At least kind of
okay.
vaguely plausible, but New Zealand, the French had just blown up a ship in our waters and we were quite annoyed about it.
Yeah.
We weren't going to go and blow up a Russian ship, I
Well,
don't think. But anyway,
I just say that all of those things were just speculation and possibly Cold War imaginations running wild.
And also kind of fun. Yeah. Actually, it wasn't just conspiracy theorists who were concerned about the lack of answers. So several senior mariners, including no less Captain Cook, not that one, obviously, but Captain Ian Cook, the Deputy Harbour Master of Timaru, they stuck their necks out and went public with calls for a full inquiry. So Cook said more effort needed to be put into figuring out why the ship's captain wasn't on the bridge at the time of the collision. Though, to be fair, we do know he was adjusting his tie, and that is time-consuming. Anyway, he also said...
Coming is here.
He also said there were discrepancies in accounts, the discussions between the government and the ship's owners about whether there would be a full inquiry. In one statement, the government said it had consulted the owners before making the decision, and another, it said that it hadn't. It seems that Cook here is sort of questioning whether the owners had improperly influenced the government's decision. Preble, for his part, called the ongoing questioning and allegations irresponsible, outrageous and absurd. But that's just kind of how politicians talk, right? He said any inquiry would have been pointless. New Zealand had no authority to order the Soviets to appear before an inquiry or take any action against the Russian seamen if there were any breaches found. Also, said Preble, any action against Jamison would have been a farce because the Soviets had indicated they were unwilling to cooperate in any trial.
Yeah. And we should say, over the years, Preble has dismissed the questions around the sinking as the work of conspiracy theorists. But it also must be said, he hasn't exactly helped the situation. Years ago, author Michael Guerin, who we mentioned earlier, sought access to some of Preble's files in the National Archives, but he couldn't get to them. Letters to Preble asking his permission to see the documents went unanswered. Preble told RNZ several years ago that, yes, there were documents in the archives that he had sealed, but he insisted the information in them was readily available elsewhere, and so, in other words, no big deal. He said there was no cover-up. The decisions made at the time were just the reality of trying to deal with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. For their part, the Soviets disciplined the navigator, issuing him a suspended jail sentence and fining him for failing to cancel Jamison's, quote, incomprehensible order, end quote, to take the liner through that dangerous passage. Captain Vorobyev,
Vorobyev, I reckon.
Vorobyev was dismissed from his duties on the ship and transferred to shore work. There was praise for the crew members from the Soviets, whose official news agency TASS declared the crew's skills prevented the loss of more life. The faultless training and sangfroid of the crew allowed the evacuation of the passengers in the shortest time onto New Zealand ships, which had sped to the place of the shipwreck. That's an official Soviet news agency report.
Did they report that the captain said there's no Mayday and stopped coming to rescue us? But anyway,
I don't believe they did. Don Jamison has steadfastly refused to be interviewed about the sinking. He resigned as Picton pilot, but was allowed to stay on as harbour master. He kept up his career in the maritime world until he retired in 2006, having spent the last 10 years of his career working for the freight company Straight Shipping. The only thing he has said about the Mikhail Lermontov was to that preliminary inquiry, a statement he fought to keep secret. But eventually, the transcript was released, and it just revealed that he couldn't explain what he'd done. Taking the vessel inside the Jackson Head lighthouse had not been part of any considered plan. He concluded his statement to the inquiry by saying,
I cannot explain my actions. Had anyone asked me to draw courses for the vessel out of Queen Charlotte Sound, it would certainly not have included a course through the passage taken. Similarly, had anybody asked my advice as to taking the vessel through that passage, I would have recommended against it. I'm therefore at a loss to explain my actions at the time. I would like to express my deepest regret that the incident occurred and any part which I may have played in it.
Earlier in his statement on the preliminary inquiry, he called what he'd done a, quote, sudden decision made on the spur of the moment and quite out of keeping with my normal behaviour. He then went on to offer, not excuses as such, but what he said were possible explanations. For instance, he said,
"In hindsight, the only explanation I can offer for the action I took is that I was suffering from mental and physical exhaustion, and that I was overstressed as a result of working long hours for an excessive period of time, and that as a result of such, I was not in an adequate physical and mental condition to be acting as a pilot. Obviously, I did not recognise that I was in such a condition at the time."
He then went on to talk about the stresses of his, and it must be said, multiple jobs, and his long working hours, and he brought up the heavy fall he'd had on the bridge. He was asked if he had consumed any alcohol or drugs starting from the Saturday night when he first arrived on the ship to pilot it to Wellington, and he listed, over that time, 4 cans of lager in the bar on the Saturday evening before dinner, a gin and tonic and half a bottle of white wine at dinner, 2 glasses of vodka and a glass of beer at lunchtime on Sunday at that celebratory lunch on the ship.
So, yeah, whether that's a lot or not depends on your views on what's a lot or not, I guess. Jamison said he believed he was not impaired by any consumption of alcohol, but noted in hindsight, it may be indicative of my condition in that I would normally never consume alcohol for several hours prior to carrying out a pilotage function. It's worth noting Captain Vorobyev was also asked about how much he had drunk, and his answer was, not a drop since leaving Russia.
Mm. The preliminary inquiry repeated in its conclusion Jamison's line that it was an unexplained, sudden decision to take the ship on the course which led to its sinking. However, the police investigation later questioned the use of the word sudden, pointing out that Jamison's command, port 10 degrees, came about 4 to 5 minutes before the ship struck the rocks. In other words, there was time to alter course. Or, as the police report concluded, this takes it out of the category of a sudden, impetuous decision. Still, no charges were laid. In interviews over the years, police involved in the case have said the only option available to them would have been to prosecute Jamison for a breach of the Harbours Act, and the penalties did not justify the cost of taking such a case. It would have been technical stuff that attracted small fines, so it seemed it really wasn't worth it. So that's it. The sinking of the Mikhail Lermontov, an enduring mystery.
Nearly. What about that photo? The one of Putin, or possibly Putin.
Yeah. So that photo. So, and there's TV footage too of this. You can have a look at it online. It was taken while Russian witnesses were heading to the preliminary inquiry into the sinking held in Wellington. And as well as the crew, there were a couple of other officials, thought at the time to be from the embassy. But then years later, it was claimed that one of them was Putin. At the time, he was and by the way, if you don't know, he's the president of Russia. But anyway, just thought maybe people didn't know who he was. But anyway.
Yeah, the context is important.
Yeah. So at the time, he was a KGB agent based in Germany. And it's been alleged he made at least 2 trips to New Zealand during and sort of around that period that he may have had some sort of oversight role or sort of keeping an eye on things for the spy agency. One time, it's claimed he was in Auckland undercover as a shoe salesman in the early 80s or so.
Okay.
Yeah, this seems far-fetched, I'll admit. But there was a story published in 2021 in which it was claimed Putin had been a barter shoe salesman in Auckland.
Is it barter as in like barter bullets?
Barter bullets,
okay.
yeah.
This is, I think, a strongly New Zealand reference. Maybe they're sold in Australia as well. But anyway,
yeah,
I did love that barter bullets ad. Anyway, carry on.
Barter bullets. The guy who remembered him described him as having more hair back then. I mean, who doesn't? A love for chocolate biscuits and, quote, an eye for the ladies.
Okay, KGB undercover in somewhere in Auckland selling shoes. That feels less likely than the thing about the nuclear submarines. But that's that. What about this photo? Because I can see the similarity, like we were saying before, the eyes, the nose, the jaw, the broad Slavic cheekbones, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Is that Mr. Putin or not?
Well, look, I mean, there's tons of speculation, and there's Reddit. Do you call them subthreads?
Yeah. Something like that.
You're a Reddit
subthreads,
guy.
Kind of. Subreddits.
Subreddits. There we go. Thanks,
you.
Connor. about it, and people sort of come back and forth with their theories, and you can sort of plot the timings and stuff, and it's plausible. And then you look at him
and flying a couple of KGB agents over for the sinking of $140 million. I mean, it's totally reasonable. I mean, that dude, whoever it is probably a KGB agent, even if it's not Putin, right?
I mean, you could see how it would be.
Yeah.
At the very least,
the guy on the right looks like
I think
KGB muscle to me. Like he would do the assassinations if that's not libelous to suggest.
That's right. It could be a barter bullet salesman. You never know. For any government, this was highly embarrassing to have had happened, and so they had a lot to protect. And so, of course, they'd be sending out officials. And given what we know about how the Soviets operated at the time, and to be fair, how America operated at the time as well, with the Cold War going on, it's not unreasonable that a KGB agent was sent out.
Yep.
So, but
on the face of it, is that
Vladimir Putin's I've been avoiding it, but look, I'm going to say probably not. Probably not. What do you reckon?
When I looked at this just earlier, I would say pretty strongly, but having seen some other comparative images from about that time, I just don't know. I just don't know.
There are photos.
It's like it's not definitely not him.
Yeah.
Like it's not,
It's not chalk and cheese.
It's not chalk
when
and
you
cheese.
look at the reference photos that we know are Putin from around that time, he had a child born around that time.
Yes, there's a baby.
There's a photo of him holding a baby,
and there's a mugshot from Germany.
German files,
a corporate kind of mugshot thing.
Yeah. They probably had it in the annual report.
Yes,
but when you look at those, you go, it's not him, but there's enough differences to me that mean. It's not 100%. I don't think it's him. Yeah, I don't know. What do you reckon, Connor? Final call.
Could be him.
Could be him.
Not him.
Not him.
Conclusive.
All right. Okay.
Well, clearly, we recommend you use the Google.
Yeah.
And just
we'll chuck some links in our show notes.
Go and have it. Figure it out yourself.
And in fact, in our newsletter, we'll put the links as well.
Oh yes, newsletter as well.
So a few years ago, the question was put to the Russian embassy, and they batted it away, saying these sorts of things should be water under the bridge to New Zealanders. End of.
Long Story Short is made by Te Productions, which is me, Adam Dudding, and him, Eugene Bingham. Our engineer and editor is Connor Scott. Thanks to Anton.
And the final arbiter on
Putin Matters. Thanks to Anton for the theme music and Phil Johnson for the awesome artwork.
Also, for this episode, I was fortunate enough to be able to access some excellent journalism from the time of the sinking and the inquiry, as well as the books Death of a Cruise Ship by Tom O'Connor and the Mikhail Lermontov Enigma by Michael Guerin. Especially helpful was reading the report of the preliminary inquiry and all the transcripts and all of that, which I was able to do at the Auckland Library. Go Libraries! As I said, we'll include links to all those things in our newsletter.
We're on the usual podcast platforms and also on YouTube and everywhere else. So please subscribe, give us 5 stars, write a review, all those sort of things. And we'll see you soon with the next episode of Long Story Short.
Hei kona.